Hey, so I'm sure all you guys have heard this term or this phrase, fear of the Lord, or fear God, or fear the Lord, some variation of that. That's one of the most common ways used in the Old Testament to describe what it means to live in relationship with God. Now, it's not something that it's not really language that we typically use. And often part of the problem of using vocabulary like this, like fear the Lord or fear of God or something like that, is that we miss out on what that really means. It's often just a Christian type phrase that you throw out there. So I want to talk a little bit about fear the Lord and hopefully give some understanding of what that phrase means in the Old Testament and then how that applies to the way we understand who Jesus is now as Christians. So fear of the Lord is a phrase that's basically shorthand for living in faithful obedience to God. Now, when we talk about fear, we typically think in terms of being scared, right? So like you're afraid of a bad storm. Well, you might not be, but I'm afraid of a bad storm, or something might scare you. You think of like scary movies, or you think of like hunkering down. I was once in a mall shooting. That was scary, right? I feared for my life as a gunman, shot into this restaurant that I was in. So that's one aspect of fear, and that is a part of what the Old Testament is talking about when it talks about fear of the Lord. Okay, we should rightly have a distinct fear of the most powerful being that you can ever imagine. Think about in the New Testament and in the Old Testament when angels appeared. What was the response? They were sore afraid, right? The shepherds were sore afraid when the angels responded to them. That's because angels are magnificent and scary, right? They're frightening. The same that carries over also into the idea of fear of the Lord. But there's another aspect of it that is more difficult to pick up on in our culture, and that is the reverential awe, yes, but living in relationship with God. Fearing God means we obey God. And like Jesus talks about in the New Testament, we obey, like proof that we are in Christ, that we are abiding in Christ, is that we obey him. And that's what the Old Testament is getting at when it talks about fear of the Lord. It's talking about living in right relationship with God, abiding in God, having obedience to God. Let me share a little bit of a story that I think will maybe put some handles on this concept for you. When I was a little kid, before my parents got a divorce, there's something happened in the kitchen. And my dad says to me, like, don't go in the kitchen. And I'm like, okay. So I'm a little kid, like I have no idea how old I was, younger than 6. That's kind of my, the before and after moments in life. My parents' divorce is one of those. So it was before that. And that happened when I was 6. And so my dad says, like, don't go in the kitchen, right? And so I was like, okay, I won't go in the kitchen. And so I immediately walked into the kitchen, and my feet got cut up with glass, right? He had dropped a glass, it had broken on the kitchen floor, and I walked right into it. Now, I also received a spanking from my dad for disobeying him. And so the thing that I learned from this, the way this applies to fear of the Lord, is I learned that at least at that point in my life, my dad had my best interest in mind, right? He did not want me to cut my feet on the glass. So he told me not to do it. I disobeyed. I did not fear my father, and I walked in there and my feet got cut up. And in addition to that, I also got a spanking, right? And so I learned to fear my dad in the sense that he can spank me, and also to obey my dad because he had my best interest at heart. It wasn't like he was trying to keep me from some wonderful thing. It's that he didn't want me to cut my feet open, right? And so I learned this lesson, this concept of fear meant living in a relationship in which I obeyed him, right? And so I also learned that he can inflict punishment on me that is very, what's the right word? Uh, uncomfortable. I don't know if you guys can hear my phone ringing right now, but I have like an old flip phone, and so the tune is like pretty funny. But anyway, that's what you hear in the background maybe. So all this to say, I learned to fear my dad because he could punish me, and I also learned to fear my dad because he loved me, right? And so fearing the Lord is most definitely includes this aspect of like God is this mighty, powerful being who can squash us. He doesn't, thankfully. But it also includes this concept of obedience, faithfulness, walking with God, living in right relationship with God. What the New Testament identifies, what Jesus identifies in the book of John as abiding in Christ. I'd love to hear your thoughts on